People who work in graveyards, morgues, embalming bodies. What's the weirdest thing you've seen? So my dad worked as material management at a Chicago university in the early 70s. He was one of the guys who took bodies down to the morgue when they died. He shared with me two interesting stories that always stuck out. Please keep in mind that my dad was a stoner and pretty resourceful. One of the first guys he had to take to the morgue was extremely overweight, an anomaly for the 1970s. Dad said he was pushing this guy to the morgue and took a turn too hard in the basement just feet from the destination. This huge dead guy goes rolling onto the floor. Dad tried to drag him into the morgue, but he couldn't move him whatsoever. He called a maintenance guy down, and they used a forklift. This was all in the early morning hours, so not too many people around. They got this guy into the morgue, but they made one fatal mistake. They left the guy face down. Dad said he was called into work to explain why this man who passed away last night had a flat face. Dad said the place was sued for that. We are just all bags of meat. The second story has to do with a baby. So beware of that. I don't know many details of the baby. I just know it was a baby and Dad had to take it down. The policy at the time was to treat the baby like any other dead body, and to put it on a gurney, and take it down to the morgue covered in a sheet. Well, Dad thought it would be pretty obvious that there was a dead baby on the gurney, even with a sheet covering it up. So he borrowed a stroller and put the baby in that and covered it up. When he was in the elevator with the baby, some lady wanted to see the baby. She loved babies, I guess, and kept badgering Dad about it. He kept telling her that it was asleep and to keep her voice down. She insisted to the point where Dad finally said, "Fine, yeah, go ahead." Freaked that lady the foo out. I believe he was fired for that. I worked as a grammatical for a family-owned cemetery mortuary for a few years. 20 years ago. Craziest thing that ever happened. I got a call from my boss at 11 p.m. one night. No alarms yet, we were on call on the weekends, so a late night call from the boss wasn't that weird. This is where normal ended. He asked me to come down to the cemetery ASAP and open a grave that we scheduled to be open first thing the next morning, but he needed it at midnight. He then tells me what's been happening. Apparently we disinterred 2 caskets from a cemetery in the Los Angeles area. This was in the early 2000s, and the bodies were originally buried 1979. I don't care what anyone says, stainless steel, waterproof caskets are a bad idea. The caskets were intact enough to be removed, but when they were being put into the transportation van, they bumped together, and the corners of the caskets broke, releasing the contents, the fluid contents, all over the inside of the van. The driver was not happy, but got on I-5 to Sacramento anyway for the 6-hour drive. The driver said he gagged the entire trip. He said the smell was so bad he drove with his head out the window to avoid the smell. He called the boss and told the boss that the graves need to be open and ready the second he arrived, so that we could get these caskets in the ground and covered as soon as possible, which we did. The next day, before the mortuary opened, we had locals calling and complaining about the smell. The fire department came by. The police eventually called to inquire about the complaints and the smell. It was coming, not from the grave, but from the van used to transport the caskets. We stripped out the carpet and burned it. The plastic came next, and we bathed that in bleach, then drenched the inside of that van with every cleaning chemical that we had. Nothing helped. So, the boss called the insurance company. The adjuster showed up, and the boss met him outside at his car, across the parking lot from the van. The adjuster immediately asked about the horrible smell. The boss told him that it was coming from the van, and that why he was here. The adjuster looked at him for about 3 seconds and said, "It's totaled, I'll call a tow truck," then got back into his car and drove away. Dad used to dig graves as a side hustle in our small town cemetery. Some notable stories he's told. Extremely obese, extremely impoverished woman dies. Standard practice at the time was that the state would pay for the coffin and burial if the family couldn't pay. If Dad knew them, he would usually volunteer if they couldn't pay. The state coffins were cheap wood, and this lady couldn't fit. She had to be buried in a body bag. They tried to lower her down as gently as possible, but the body fell, and the bag ripped and an arm fell out. Family is pressing around the grave trying to watch as Dad is trying to cover the grave before they can see what's happened. His pet peeve was families wanting to see the grave covered. According to him, it was pretty common for cheap caskets to give, and nobody needs to see that. Also, they would usually get in the way, and it's hard enough to maneuver a backhoe around a cemetery without extra people around. The cemetery had a new part and an old part. The old part dates back to the late 19th century, during a time period when many people could not afford tombstones or any kind of permanent marker. Some people still have family plots in this area. So, those graves typically needed to be dug by hand, and occasionally remains from an unlabeled grave would have to be moved or adjusted. You're asking yourself, why don't they just refuse to bury people in that part of the cemetery? Well, people are not rational when it comes to death and dying, and if they want to be buried next to Great Aunt Gertrude, that's what they're getting, even if they have to share space. I worked in a cemetery for years, and became good friends with the operator of the on-site crematorium. He opened the retort for me a couple of times while folks were being processed, usually towards the end when there was not much recognizable left, though the skull doesn't completely break down, usually. It was genuinely amazing to witness. Probably the weirdest thing I encountered were them Fing neighbors who bitched and moaned about the noise of the interments. Seriously, guys. You buy a house next to a centuries-old cemetery and are shocked when there are funerals. The funeral directors had some wild stories, though. People who die at the top of narrow spiral stairs, a funeral director spraining his wrist lifting a casket into the hearse and tipping the corpse into the street, all kinds of stuff. When I was younger and was an altar boy, I lived serving funerals because you got paid, and the cool funeral director stories. So we were doing the funeral of my friend's 7-year-old brother who died during a heart surgery. It was tough, so the director was telling us funny stories on the way to the cemetery. One of his stories was, it was winter, and if there is snow on the ground, typically the cemetery won't allow a gravesite service. You instead use their chapel, and they take the casket down afterward. He says they had a family that was adamant they carry the casket, go to the grave, etc. It's bitter cold, icy and snow. The grave is about 50 yards down a hill from the road you arrive on. The staff pleaded for their safety not to go forward. The pallbearers get the casket and start toward the grave. They get about 6 steps, lead guy falls on his ass. Casket hits the ground and he says this thing takes off down TGSTIC, snowy hill like a luge. The family is screaming, his worry is the casket gets damaged and they'll have to back to the funeral home, etc. He said it felt like slow motion. The casket is flying toward the gravesite and the metal lowering device sure to smash the casket. Instead it hit a bump and the front of the casket lifts up and it hits the front of the lowering device and slides to a stop with a bit of bang right in the lowering device cradle. They all ran down, inspected, and everything appeared fine. He had sledded 50 yards down a hill and landed perfectly on top of his grave. Family slowly started to laugh and by the end thought it was fitting of their family member. I worked as an assistant funeral director in the UK 10 years ago. I love my job. It was a real honor to be able to provide a service to so many families. One thing that always bothered me. The amount of unclaimed cremated remains, ashes, we were left with over the years. We had a large attic space above the garages that housed the limos. Within that space were hundreds of unclaimed plastic urns with the remains of various people of all ages, several children or young adults. There were ashes going back since the 1950s. These have basically been passed down to each owner of the funeral home. When I became pregnant and it became too much of a risk to have me carting bodies around, it was my job to try and get these poor souls back to their families. That was a mammoth task, with many ashes staying with us due to nobody wanting to take responsibility for them. Sad really. We had to arrange the funerals of many children and babies. They were always the ones that got us the most. They were, along with anyone else that passed through our doors, treated with love, respect and dignity for the entire time they were with us. One really sad story I remember, although some details are unclear, was of a lovely lady in her 30s. She was a religious woman, although I am unsure of her faith. Unfortunately, herself and her husband had suffered with losing 4 babies at various times, none of which ever took a breath. Because they didn't take that breath, they weren't permitted by their religious leaders to give their babies religious burials. They were essentially told that because their children didn't breathe, they didn't count. They had to have each baby cremated, something their religion frowned upon, and Mum would secretly come to our funeral home 4 times a year, on each of their birthdays, and spend an hour or so in the reflection room, with their cremated remains in tiny little boxes. It was the saddest and most upsetting thing to witness. We made sure she was loved and supported each time she walked through our doors. There are so many stories, but I genuinely feel like I'd be doing those people a misjustice by writing about them. But either way, that was the most interesting, emotionally charged and rewarding job I've ever had. I miss it. Though, funerals and tombstones are the family business, and my dad has a lot of stories. Here are 2 particularly gross ones. Dad and crew were called out to a cemetery to clean a mausoleum, which usually meant scrubbing off graffiti or fixing something which broke. Instead, the groundskeeper brought them over to a tomb where a recently interred body had popped. Black goop running down the walls and the worst stench of his life. He noped out and called the hazmat crew. Another time they were dropping a vault, cement box the casket goes inside, into a gravesite before a funeral, and noticed what looked like large pieces of grilled meat at the bottom of the hole. On asking the cemetery directory what was up, the hole is supposed to be empty, he was told to ignore it. He did not ignore it, and instead brought it up with some others, eventually notifying the authorities. Turned out they had a crematorium on site and were only partially burning the bodies as a means of saving money. The leftovers were being dropped in the graves of others being buried. Few people went to jail for that apparently. I worked in a jail and the county morgue was attached to it. I'd sometimes go help them move corpses around. One night we were transferring a body into a hearse to be taken to the funeral home. All of our gurneys are from like the 1950s to 1960s. They didn't really make them to handle a morbidly obese person back then. The gurney broke and dumped a very, very fat corpse on top of the new guy I was trying to show how to do the job. Knocked him over and pinned him underneath, and it took 3 of us to roll the corpse off of him. He was in hysterics and quit, and we all got yelled at for it, even though it was solely due to the fact that we have outdated and worn out equipment. But yeah, the bodies being brought in are bigger and bigger as years go on, and the equipment for handling corpses usually was only designed for bodies half that size at max. We tried to be as respectful as possible while handling the dead, but there's just not a dignified way to move a 500-pound dead person. I have a story about this very thing. We had a female patient who weighed about 550 pounds, about 249 kilograms. She had a bowel blockage, and the MDs were trying to get her to lose a little weight so that they could perform surgery on her. Her husband was this small, skinny little guy who kept sneaking food into her room. Food like Twinkies, cookies, etc. Our hospital was good size, but not huge. I worked nights, and we would have to coordinate with the crew upstairs, just so we could turn her over on her side, as it took 10 of us to do so. Sometimes we had to call our 2 maintenance guys to help if the crew upstairs was busy. She would scream and slap at us, and threaten to sue because we wouldn't feed her. Anyhow, she refused to diet at all, and she wound up passing away after about 7 days as a patient up on MedSurg. She was only 34. She left behind a 16-year-old daughter and a grandbaby. Well, the patient was too big to take down to the morgue, because she never would have 1, fit through the door, and 2, never would have fit into one of the individual stainless steel stalls that held our deceased. I worked in the oldest hospital in my city, built in 1863, and the morgue only had a single door at that time, which could not accommodate her size. In fact, when she was admitted, they had to take her down to the warehouse and use the industrial scale to weigh her. Eventually we decided to leave her in her bed. It was a special bed for heavy people that we called a big boy bed, and pack her in ice until day shift could handle the removal. I heard that day shift had to wheel her down to the loading dock in the warehouse and use a forklift to move her into an ambulance that had a heavy-duty frame. That's the one and only time I had to deal with a human being that large.